Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak here today. I'll just make a brief comment, or two brief comments. The first is that was actually the first time that I met my political opponent, Judith Tizard, and that was a very interesting moment. There's quite a lot more to that story, but I won't go there because I recognise that this is not a political forum. The second point that I'd make is you've mentioned that I should be applying my judicial skills in Parliament. So I'm not sure what you meant by that. The only thing that I would say is that I'm not sure the New Zealand public would appreciate us cloning many of our current politicians. But we can talk about that later. Look, today I want to firstly acknowledge you, in particular, this club, for your contribution to Motutapu Island. As some of you will know, I represent not only the CBD of Auckland, but also the Western Bays and the Hauraki Gulf. And a big part of some of my work since I've been elected has been specifically in the Hauraki Gulf area. I believe that the Hauraki Gulf is one of the greatest things that Auckland has, and we've never even marketed that to the world. And so some of the work that has happened around Motutapu is a very important puzzle within the Gulf, and I just want to acknowledge this club in particular for the work that you have done on Motutapu. And I understand that you're one of the only clubs with an environmental committee, so I congratulate you on that. Today I'm going to touch on a few national issues, but then I really want to talk about Auckland and give you a bit of a snapshot as to where I think we've come from in the last couple of years around progress in terms of Auckland, but then also where I think some of the opportunities are in the future and some of the hard decisions that we need to make around Auckland. So from a national perspective, we've touched on a little bit of my background. I worked at the Halifax Bank of Scotland as well. So I had a small, I would say a small experience in the private sector, but I did have some private sector experience. But one of the reasons why I came home was definitely the Prime Minister. And I suppose it's very easy for a backbencher to say that, particularly when you're hoping to be in Cabinet at some point. It's a very greasy thing to say, but genuinely, I think he is extraordinary in that not only does he have a decent success story himself in terms of the private sector, but he also has an incredible heart, and we see that, and we've seen it never more so with some of the events that have shaken New Zealand over the last couple of years. And I came back to, because I recognise a big part of politics is actually timing. So there are many people that want to make a contribution, but if you don't get your timing right, then you may not have that opportunity. And I saw both Bill and John as two people that have the capacity to make extraordinary changes to New Zealand. And some of the stuff that you see in the news at the moment, but I'm not going to go into that because that's politics, is really a debate about how fast the economic reform is happening, in my view. I think a lot of people agree with the direction, but there's a debate to be had about the pace of change. And I'm sure there are many of you in this room that have some strong views on that. But I think if you look at what has happened in the last couple of years between a couple of earthquakes, Pike River, I would also say, obviously the economic recession, but we've had some extraordinary challenges. And Bill has been clear that some of those are one-off challenges. They're not things that are going to necessarily stymie us from an institutional or infrastructure perspective. So they're one-offs, but it does mean that this year is crunch time and that we have to make some very hard decisions about debt and savings in this country. And I think that's a massive opportunity, actually. Because I think if some of those events hadn't happened, then maybe we wouldn't have had to have that dialogue and actually have to make some of those big decisions around the direction of the country. So whilst it's been tough, there are some opportunities that have come out of some of the things that have happened. So in terms of Auckland, I campaigned when I came back, basically on my selection as also on what I campaigned for the electorate. So I said, look, I'm a young professional, I haven't had a whole lot of experience, I acknowledge that, but fundamentally, I believe in Auckland. I believe it's a city that is absolutely untapped in terms of its potential. We have, not only do we have the Haraki Gulf, we probably have, in my view, one of the best waterfronts in the world, but it is totally locked up. And that is part of the opportunity of the future of Auckland, is to look at some of our assets, whether they be the Haraki Gulf, whether it be the Auckland waterfront, and say, how do we now better market ourselves to the world? So one of the hardest things that I've been involved in since I've been elected has been the Auckland governance reform. And that, if you look back through, as I did through the Hansard, and looked at how many politicians have talked about reforming Auckland to create one regional entity, the funding and the power, to be able to deliver infrastructure across Auckland, it had been talked about for a very long time. And again, I would say, whatever happens to me in the future, that is probably the greatest change that we can make, that we could have made, I think, in a generation to influence and enhance both social and economic development in Auckland. And it was really hard. We had a lot of, I called fiefdoms that have been built up in Auckland. The process wasn't perfect, we acknowledge that. We don't think there will probably have to be changes in the future. And that it's with such the scale of, that the reform was of such a scale that I think would be very difficult to get it 100% right. And I'll give you one example of where it was a massive call for the Select Committee and for the government. That was around what is local versus what is regional. And we made a decision not to prescribe some of the functions and powers of the Auckland Council because we were of the view that actually I've got, for instance, Waiheke as a local board, Great Barrier Island, but also the Waitemata Gulf. And so, in any given day, I will have people walking through my office wanting to create completely different projects in the community, having completely opposing views on particular issues. And what we made a decision was that there are clearly some things that have to happen at a regional level, and the whole reform hinges on the fact that finally we are able to have some regional growth and have some actually be able to build the couple of 100,000 houses that we need to accommodate population growth by 2030. But there are also some things that need to happen at a local level whereby we don't want to be as parliamentarians dictating what they are. Actually, we didn't think we need to do that. But that was an example whereby there are a few things within the legislation that I always say watch this space because we may need to relook at that in the future. But as a whole, from a progress perspective, can I say how much is happening as a result of this reform in the last, since the reform came through, at a local level? I'll just talk a little bit about some of the progress that I've seen. So I'll give you an example. I tried to get a pedestrian crossing for some kids walking from the CBD to my school at Freeman's Bay. That took me, under the previous Auckland City Council, NZTA, all of these different agencies that I was dealing with, it had taken me months and months just to be able to work out the right official that would have some responsibility to do the various reports. I can tell you within the first couple of weeks of the reform happening, we had progress and we now have a pedestrian crossing. And I know it sounds like a small issue, but you've got kids walking across the motorway effectively, and because of the number of agencies involved, it was near impossible to get anything done. I also have many other situations like bus routes, students who want bus routes from central Auckland out to Albany campus, you're having to deal with a number of different councils to be able to get anything done. So I think there's a lot more happening at a local level, and it's going to take a little while for Aucklanders to see that. But the real decisions that have to be made, in my view, are around some of the big pieces of infrastructure. And I see probably the Mayor on a weekly basis. I meet with him along with other national MPs on a sort of every 3 months. But the discussions that are happening, and you obviously know what the Mayor campaigned on in terms of transport projects, need to have a dose of realism within them. And what I say to people is, look, Canterbury has changed the game. That doesn't mean that Auckland needs to stop, right? And the challenge for our government is actually to make Auckland go faster. But within that, the Auckland Council needs to now realise its power. The Auckland Council has an asset base of 30 billion. And if you think about the major infrastructure projects that people have been talking about for the last 20 years, the cruise ship terminal, convention centre, exhibition centre, the development of the waterfront, it's not rocket science, actually. I think there is actually a lot of political consensus around those major ticket items. The question is how you fund them. And I'm very complimentary about the Mayor in a couple of areas. One is that he's done a lot in a short space of time, in my view, around creating Auckland as a tourism destination, thinking about the infrastructure that needs to exist, thinking about, from a major events capacity, how we get a larger share of the market. But there's going to be some crunch points over the next year around how we fund some of that infrastructure. And I'm pretty keen to help lead some of that discussion. I'm actually doing quite a bit of work around that, and so I welcome any of you who want to contribute to that piece of work. But in my view, it's not that that central government haven't said that we won't contribute to some of that, but we need the Auckland Council to do its fair share. And it's really frustrating. I saw Jeff Kennett. Did anyone here see Jeff Kennett speak recently? So Jeff Kennett transformed Melbourne with about $1 billion. He went to Paul Keating, the Prime Minister at the time. You probably all know the story. But he picked about 6 big pieces of infrastructure. They were cultural, they were sporting, but he did that. They ended up borrowing money, and that actually transformed that city. And it's very frustrating from my perspective to be sitting there and knowing that there is actually quite a lot of political consensus around some of these transformational projects, and I put the CBD rail loop as one of those. And to be knowing that actually this is about finally central and local government coming together and putting their cards on the table and saying, well, what hard calls are you going to make versus what hard calls can we make to actually transform Auckland. But that's where my focus is that there's a massive opportunity now. We have the governance structure. There is no excuse for central and local government to not be able to come together over some of those big ticket items in terms of infrastructure. And I just do want to touch on the CBD rail loop. So, as I said before, I'm doing 8 public meetings this week actually in the CBD. So I've invited every single person who lives in the CBD to come and meet me, which you can imagine you get a very wide variety of people who turn up to those meetings. But I think there is, both from the business groups that I've spoken to, but also within, I think, a number of local and central government politicians, a realisation that that particular project is the highest priority of the major transport projects. And it is frustrating when people think it's about just the CBD, when actually it's about doubling capacity in the rail network. And that is a major reason why that project is so important. But also, if you look at what is happening in central Auckland, and you look at the work that Bob's doing around the waterfront, we could have 60,000 people living in the CBD. If you look at we had 1,500 25 years ago. We now have 20,000. So it is a major growth area, and it's going to be very important to be able to have